As a happy retiree, I'd like to sort of introduce Simon Moore to sort of give the talk today. Simon's going to talk about the science policy interface, and Simon's been working for the last 10, 11 years in Ireland. He's the Professor of Veterinary Epidemiology at the Veterinary School in Dublin, and also Director of a risk assessment group. Simon's had a very varied career, working in practice, working in the Rural Land Protection Board for a couple of years, done a PhD at James Cook, worked for Ausvet, so worked at the Queensland Uni. So he's had a very varied career. So I'd like to welcome Simon to talk about the science interface with examples from Ireland. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Brian, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you folks. I guess just to give you a little bit of background, I'm here for a few days working with Brian, really trying to look at lessons learned from the BTEC program that are relevant internationally. Australia has been very quiet in its success, in my view. Very few countries were successful with TB, and there are lessons that other countries could learn. So that's the reason I'm here. So yes, I wanted to talk about working at the science policy interface, and I'll try and tease that out a little bit further. Ireland is very different from Australia, and but I think hopefully there's interest in what I have to say. So first, I'd like to just give a couple of comparisons. It took me a while to sort of tease out these figures, and I'm not sure if they're 100% correct, but hopefully they're close. The first thing, in terms of land area, you can fit 100 Republic of Islands into Australia, and based on calculations Brian and I just did a couple of moments ago, probably 20 Republic of Islands into the territory. So the land area is vastly different, obviously. A lot more people here. Similar GDP per person, and then if we shift to the cattle industry, I think you'll be surprised in a moment about actually how similar the two industries are in terms of value, even though there's big differences in numbers. So you've got approximately 30 million head here, just over 6 million in Australia, and the number slaughtered is about a third. Live exports are similar, but to be honest, the export of live animals from Ireland is essentially calves that are being sent across, mainly to the Netherlands and to Spain. So obviously big differences. In terms of beef exports, Ireland is really fairly unique in Europe in that almost everything is exported. So Irish beef is very common throughout Europe, and the value of exported beef at 2.1 billion euro is perhaps half of the value of exported beef from Australia, $6 billion. In terms of dairy exports, you've got more cattle here in Australia, much less farms, as we would expect. The farms are much bigger here, but the amount exported is a great deal less. You're looking at, again, about 85% of product exported from Ireland, and the value of dairy exports is bigger than it is in Australia. So even though the land area is tiny, only 1/100th of the Australian landmass, the cattle industries are actually, in terms of value, are not that different. Certainly they're bigger in Australia in terms of beef, somewhat bigger in dairy in Ireland. And I wanted to show you this, and then you'll realise that we are talking about very different things. This is an aerial photo from one of the counties in the Midlands of Ireland, and you'll notice, if you just have a look down the bottom left there, you're looking at a kilometre in terms of the distance that's indicated. So these are very small areas, and these are individual fields, and in amongst those fields If we break it down, that is one farm. And a key characteristic of Irish farms is fragmentation, and it's all related to history. Everything in Ireland's related to history. So you've got a fragmented farm. Within 25 metres of the boundary of that farm, you have 21 other herds. And each of those herds might have lots of fragments as well. So you can see here, for example, this farm here has lots of fragments. This farm. So you've got this huge interconnectivity, and that has huge implications in terms of disease control. And if we move out to 150 metres, you've got 24 farms. So we've got this huge fragmentation of land over tiny areas. And if we move to a kilometre, you've got 65 herds. And these are all independent, essentially family-run units. Brian asked I show a few photos, and I think it's really helpful to do so. This is a dairy farm from Tipperary, probably not too far from where Ned Kelly came from, although obviously a bit of a time ago. A family-run farm. Unlike the UK, the sheds, etc., they're not built for attractiveness. They're fairly basic. This is a farm here. Talk about 30 or 40 shades of green, and it's true. It's very green sort of country. There's calves at the front and probably dry cows. Basic dairy as anywhere. And the key feature is that cattle are housed. They're housed for probably 3 or 4 months of the year. And the reason they're housed is mainly because the ground gets so soft. And if the cattle are out, they just destroy it. It's not really because it gets too cold. In terms of myself, just to give it, Brian's already given some background, but my work is in epidemiology. I should say that it was really based on time in dairy practice in Bega, but particularly time with the Rural Land Protection Board in Canamble, that I really got sick in the field, sick of trying to guess the answers to problems, and I realised that epidemiology was valuable. And really it was here that I really gumbered epidemiology in terms of patterns in types of animals, that it was possible to really tease out what was going on. Spent some time at the uni, time in private consulting, and then the last 11 years I've been based in Ireland. So firstly, just to talk about this centre, and I thought this could be of some value to talk about it. Essentially this centre is tiny, maybe 6 people, and our whole purpose, our whole reason for existence is to provide the science to support central policy decision making by the Irish government, primarily in animal health, but to some degree in animal welfare. And it's really underpinned by this view, which I think we all accept, that if for people to make sound policy decisions, we need good, solid, objective information. And so that's where we fit. We fit here a small group funded by the National Department of Agriculture, and our work in a whole host of different areas is to provide robust, hopefully robust scientific information to support national decision making. And we would work with our policy colleagues on a daily basis, and very much saying, well, this is what we do, but for us to be effective, we need an awful lot of feedback from our policy in lots of different areas. And so I think it's a productive two-way street. And we're clearly we're not naive in terms of the policy that's eventually made. Of course, science is only part of a whole host of different issues that are considered. And Ireland, as Australia as anywhere, politics is ferocious. And of course, science is only part of the final decision in terms of what happens in the field, but it's a very important part. So our work is basically in 3 areas. I use the word regulatory, really just being that the government drives the ship. We have regulatory animal health issues, and primarily now it's TB. It was brucellosis and it was BSE, but those are no longer an issue. Brucellosis was really only eradicated recently, and it's really swap north and south of the border. So it's difficult dealing with two countries that till recently really didn't get on very well. Then we've got non-regulatory issues, and I'd like to particularly talk about Animal Health Ireland, which is somewhat similar to Animal Health Australia, but also quite different. And then we work on a number of other issues: emergency response, a lot of welfare-related work, on-farm investigations, some fisheries, international collaboration. And we're based, the small group is based in the veterinary school. There's only one veterinary school in the country, based at University College in Dublin. And 50% of our work is scientific research, and 50% is scientific, but it's more support. So we would provide a lot of support based on the expertise that's available within the group. And I guess there's, I want to highlight that there's, I guess, 5 key things that are really important in terms of us being effective. And I'd like to go through them very briefly, one by one. So in terms of strategic and highly applied, this particular diagram, of course you can't read, but it relates to a workshop that we held soon after I arrived in Ireland, saying, essentially driven by a key question. And the key question is, in terms of TB, of course there's lots of things we don't know. What are the key unresolved questions that, if we could answer them, would most effectively assist towards control and eradication? And so this is basically a mud map of the questions, and they translated through to projects. And I should say that my time with Brian and other parts of the trip here in Australia, coming back to Australia, have been in part to really try and learn from the experience here. Secondly, in terms of quality and our work, the credibility of our work is very much driven by scientific publication. And we're based in a uni, and that's what unis do, but really the reason why we publish is it really has to do with the credibility of the Irish animal health programs. Thirdly, we're independent. There's similar groups in other countries. Often they're based within government, and I think there are advantages in us being perhaps at arm's length from government. We're based in the school there. Like here, that's a good sunny day in Ireland. You wouldn't take a photo like that every day. Fourthly, and of course it's the same here, very much underpinned by key linkages nationally and internationally. And this was the first time I met Brian, was at a conference in 2005 in Dublin, the 4th Bovis conference. And we collaborate in terms of, this just in terms of the papers published, but these are the folks that we've collaborated with in the last, in a very active way. So there's huge numbers of organisations. And we do that, again, I'm sure as here, we do that for a number of reasons. The first reason is that we certainly don't have all of the expertise at all. For example, this work in terms of vaccination against badgers, there's a couple of key folks, Klaus Frank, who are mathematical biologists, which we most certainly are not. They're based in the Netherlands, and they're able to bring expertise that we don't have. The second thing is really building networks for long-term benefit to Ireland. And we would do increasingly a lot of work with Belfast, with the north of Ireland, to our mutual benefit. And then the third thing is that at times we're doing work where we're actually leading in terms of understanding current knowledge. So this work relates to a focus, something that happened in the territory a long time ago, but a focus from inputs to outputs, in this case in terms of TB. Whereas the legislation that we work under in Europe is all input-based, which is not at all helpful in terms of disease control. And so lots of projects, but very cost-effective, I think, about €500,000 a year to support a small team to undertake large numbers of projects to support national policy. So I'd just like to give you just three very brief examples of the sort of projects that we're involved with. The first thing to be aware is that in terms of animal health, we can, I guess the same here, but we can break it down in Ireland into three different groups of animal health issues. Firstly, those under government control, and they're the ones I wanted to talk about first. These are ones where biosecurity is very important, but there's a whole host of other diseases where biosecurity is important that are not under government control. And BBD and JD are several examples. And then there's those where biosecurity is generally not important. So if you've got a mess on one farm, it doesn't mean that the fellow next door has. So just talking about TB first, and there's a long history of TB and a long history of TB research in Ireland. And I won't go into it in any detail at all, apart from saying that we certainly haven't been successful yet, like you folks. And this is essentially a graph of reactors, and there's lots of different measures that could be used, with the number of reactors in recent years continuing to fall. But there's problems, and the problems are complex, and only partly, but partly they relate to the presence of a wildlife reservoir. And so in terms of TB occurrence, this is 98, 2005, 12, and you can see that there's a progressive fading of TB on the map. Problem that is essentially present throughout the island, in the north as well as in the Republic. And work over the years has disentangled the role of, in this case, of the European badger. The fact that this animal is a maintenance host. So TB will exist within badgers over the long term without any problems at all, without any contact with any other species, but also there is spillback from wildlife to cattle. And that's based on several very large field experiments that have been conducted over a number of years. So that's an important constraint, but as we'll see, that's not the only one. And the view in Ireland at the moment is Darwin Airport's quite the same, but if you're flying into Heathrow, you generally end up in a holding pattern. The island is really in a holding pattern at the moment in terms of TB. Constant aim to reduce the prevalence of TB, but until the wildlife reservoir is resolved in a sustainable way, we can't eradicate. And so the research that we would do partly focuses on TB in cattle, partly on the role of wildlife, and partly more broadly contributing at a policy at a level of particularly program. And so in terms of TB in cattle, there's been a lot of work to understand why some herds are at greater risk, opportunities for improved surveillance, opportunities for improved management of high-risk herds, and again, talking with Brian over the last couple of days, the solutions may be very different, of course, but the problems are not dissimilar. For example, residual infection is a key issue for us. And some progress is being made, and this is a graph that really gives an idea of how long it takes a herd to break down again after it's been released from quarantine. Herd released from quarantine, and this is how long it takes till it breaks down again. And the key thing is that over the last 10 years there has been substantial and significant improvement. Herds are taking longer to break down again, but they're still breaking down, and the level is still relatively high. Secondly, in terms of wildlife, a huge amount of work, particularly in Ireland and also in the UK. Firstly, to try and understand, well, what is their role? And then to understand better the ecology and the epidemiology of TB, in particular in badgers. Then through to, well, what control strategies? should say that increasingly we're concerned about deer as being an issue as well. Feral. They're essentially a feral species of deer, seeker, in particular areas. And so, as part of this, and I've only played a small role in this particular work, there's been essentially a 15-year program of experimental work through to field work towards a field vaccine that could be used for TB in badgers to try and dampen down infection. And this is just to illustrate the type of work that we would do in the background. Firstly, what's the most effective trial designed for a field trial, and the field trial has now just finished after about 4 years. What's the most effective trial design? Is there sufficient power, statistical power? How do we best use serological tests, because that's all that you have in living badgers over time. So this is the type of work we would quietly do in the background. And then lastly, contributing to policy in the TB program, partly refining the program, a key focus relating to quality control, and that is a key issue because there's a huge level of fatigue in Ireland, given that the program's been going for an awfully long period of time. So, for example, there's a focus there in terms of quality control in the national program. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of the type of work we are doing in the background in terms of TB. The second piece of work we've done relates to the formation of Animal Health Ireland. And one of the key features of Ireland, which is very different to here, is that until recently there was really no tradition at all of collective action by industry. So what happened was that where government had control of a problem, that became a government. Here, government was not under control. Was not in control. There was nothing being done at all in a collective way. So myself and colleagues have spent a lot of time quietly talking with an awful lot of people, saying, well, really, these are not government problems. The only way to address them is for us to collectively sit down and talk them through, exactly as was done here over many years, for many years. So Animal Health Ireland has essentially been a result of that discussion. It's an industry-led, not-for-profit partnership between all of the key players, and it focuses on diseases of cattle that government is not does not take control of. And so our work, part of it was really a philosophical argument. There really was a need for collective action. International examples, and we often use the Australian example, but Australia, our colleagues in Europe would generally see Australia as so incomparable, so different and perhaps one of you would concur with that, but they would see Australia as being very different, and so they really want examples closer to home. And the Dutch and the Scandinavian colleagues could readily give that. And then, so really the first step was to say, well, what's the current situation? And this, so really the modus operandi, and maybe it's similar, maybe it's different here, is firstly the need to get everyone around the table, and up to that point, there were around the table who had never done that before. Facilitate discussion, hopefully to the point of consensus, and sometimes that's taken 3 years, and sometimes it hasn't been achieved at all. The whole point is to identify what's needed. What do we need to do if we are to achieve international best practice? And once a consensus is achieved, then to develop and coordinate infrastructure. So it's been a really interesting process amongst an industry and amongst government that had not worked this way previously. And so our work is basically at this level here, the science, where we're seeking essentially to get consensus in terms of the way. In very detailed discussions with industry to move towards consensus, but on something through to an agreed national position. Coming back in terms of monitoring and critical review of progress. And so Animal Health Ireland has been going for about 5 years, and it's a co-funded organisation. And I just want to talk about mastitis, but as you can see, there's a whole, including Ireland has decided about 3 or 4 years ago to move towards BVD eradication, which is common throughout Europe. So the first thing in terms of an objective measurement of where they're at, this is a graph that shows the somatic cell count, the measure of mastitis, over about a 7 or 8 year period. And if you look at the black line is the median, meaning that half of the herds are worse and half of the herds are better. And, got the magical figure of 400,000 in terms of record. Really for a quality herd that doesn't have a mastitis problem, you're probably looking close to 200, certainly 200 to 300. You can see there, I hope, that there are a lot of herds that are highly seasonal. There's a highly seasonal production of milk in Ireland. Quite substantial peaks in cell count at the very beginning and at the very end of the season. So one of the first things that we did was, and we actually worked with sociologists, people saw this graph and we discussed that at some length, but at the end of the day it hadn't changed anything. People were, so working with sociologists, this was really important because what happened was lots of people were part of the discussion, and from throughout the industry, throughout government service providers, and everyone agreed there was a problem. Everyone said, look, there's a problem here, we need to fix it. Then the question was asked, well, what responsibility do you have in terms of helping to contribute? Every single player in the industry, every single player in the service providers amongst government said, it's a problem, but it ain't my problem to fix. Every single person said that. And that piece of information was really pivotal in terms of people saying, oh my goodness, well, I think we need to think about this a bit differently. But prior to that point, everyone said it was a problem, but it wasn't mine to fix. And so there's been a whole host of different steps taken, and they're no different. In fact, as I'll show you in a moment, we actually spent quite a lot of time with Countdown Australia in Melbourne, and they've very kindly shared a lot of their resources, which have taken quite a lot of time to adapt to the organisation. So cost calculators, farm reports, all based, but very much adapted from learning from the success of others. Just one point that might be interesting is the fact I mentioned that there was a highly seasonal worse, much better mid-year, much worse at the end of the year. And the approach that had been taken about 20 years previous was for the Irish government and Irish industry to essentially argue that not that there was a problem, but rather that this was due to a physiological effect, due to dilution, that was really a dilution. And so there was an awful lot of data adjustment that was being done, all agreed under EU legislation. But the recent evidence that we would have would suggest that that's not fixing anything. All it's doing is helping to support the problem. And so, for example, here, if you look at the dotted line, that is the level of cell count that occurs. Percentage of herds in Ireland that exceeded this magical 400,000. So you've got a lot of herds that are having problems. But following data adjustment, the number of herds that exceed dropped dramatically. So the data adjustment was not at all helpful, but it was certainly allowing farmers to continue to supply. And so we've been doing work in the background, and it's likely that the government will phase this out. We'd certainly hope so. And then the third and final example I wanted to give relates to cadmium. And I know that cadmium is a key issue. I really don't know the territory, but certainly I'm from New South Wales in that area based on fertiliser. Problem in Europe as well. But in Europe, it's not a fertiliser issue, and the reason it's not is entirely due to where fertiliser came from. So Australian fertiliser came from Nauru, I think, and high levels of cadmium, whereas in Ireland and areas of Europe it came from Morocco and a couple of other places where the levels of cadmium were lower. But anyway, there's a limit in terms of kidney cadmium in cattle, in terms of human consumption, and Belgium has found it impossible to meet those targets, and that's driven by pollution. But a few years ago it became clear to us that maybe Ireland's got a problem as well, not as a result of pollution, but actually due to natural levels. Hotspots here and here, in the middle of the country, where the levels of soil cadmium are particularly high. So we undertook some work, and this particular diagram shows where cattle were sourced from, but hopefully you can see the difference between the red and the green patches. Quite a lot of areas of the country where the levels of cadmium in the kidney of cattle exceeded the 1 milligram per kilogram wet weight. And we took that one step further to show that in the 4 different provinces of Ireland, differences, but there's this relationship between soil cadmium and also age. In fact, animals more than about 4 years of age, 3 to 4 years of age in some of the counties on high soil cadmium levels were running into problems. And so we had particular conclusions. 15% of soils exceeded the EU limit. 1 in 10 cattle had problems. These were the key predictors: the age, soil cadmium, and also the region. The kidneys of most Irish cattle under 3 would conform. That was released in about June, and within 6 weeks, industry voluntarily has decided to withdraw kidneys from older cattle. I think more than 4 years of age from human food chain. So I guess it's just another example of this science policy interface. Okay, the last thing I'd like to just talk about, because I thought it might be of interest, is that as well as working at the Irish level, I'm very fortunate to work at the European level through what's called the European Food Safety Authority. And it's really the peak body in Europe in terms of animal health and welfare, providing science to support policy decision making. But it's at a different level. It's not at the level of SEMIRA, our group in the uni supporting the Irish government. It's EFSA supporting really the policy arm of the European Parliament, I guess. And they use particular terms: risk assessment and risk management. The terms that I hadn't really thought of in this way before I worked with this group. But basically, the science is risk assessment. Policy colleagues obviously manage risk. And EFSA is an organisation. It's one of about 30 different agencies, the EU agencies. So there's an EU agency based in Stockholm for human disease. There's an agency based in London for medicines, and this agency is based in Parma in Italy. And so EFSA has about 9 different panels, and I chair the Animal Health and Welfare panel. So there's panels related to plant health, there's panels related to contaminants, pesticides, there's panels biohazards, and they're concerned with humans. So this is a picture of the website. And for example, last week, and this wasn't part of our animal health and welfare panel, through bushmeat, directly related to animal health, but it's one of the things that's done. So what happens is that generally the Commission, not always, but generally the Commission request information. They want a scientific opinion on a particular issue. The panel would then do the work, and that work was then adopted and communicated. So at the last meeting a few weeks ago, this was the agenda, and I thought it might be of interest just to show you the sort of things that we are talking through. Sheep and goat pox, very much at the EU borders, particularly related to the problems in Syria at the ED. Obviously, I'm sure that's a virus that's causing huge problems to the pig industry, predominantly in the Americas. And then there's a whole host of, this is really from endemic areas, a lot of welfare-related issues, a couple of other exotics that again are right at the EU borders, through to another churches and laying hens and welfare issues. And basically, Europe has worked hard to eradicate EBL. Most countries, and most countries now free, but it's expensive, and the view is, well, maybe they should just stop doing it. We're really looking at, well, what would be the impact? And so I try to break it into three parts. An awful lot of focus on exotic diseases of concern. These are the ones at the moment very much, apart from Rift Valley, these are the ones that are very much at the EU. Swine fever has, over the last about 7 years, started in Georgia and has moved essentially with little control up through the Russian Federation on the western side, then spilled across into Ukraine and into Belarus. Last, I think about, or since February, there's been outbreaks occurring. This is the EU border here, Poland, Lithuania. Predominantly in wild boar, as a wild species rather than in Australia. In real concern, huge concern in terms of what to do, and just being aware that there's basically a sea of infection constantly pushing. Governments, the Russian government and certainly the Belarusian government, very difficult to deal with, and then the Ukrainian government, which is very difficult to deal with. It might be of interest just to let you know that and maybe the experience has been the same here, but so it's been endemic in Russia, in epidemic proportions in Russia, in the western part of several years, and as soon as a case occurred, as soon as the first case occurred crossing the border, European pork meat into Russia. I don't need to comment further. I should say these are, I'm not familiar with these myself, but they're exotic beetle. Major concern about the importation of these pests. So, and I made a mistake, this is epidemics, so sorry about that. But for example, this is the sort of questions that they would ask. They're asking us for a scientific opinion on the current epidemiological situation in North America and Asia, and they're different. With respect to ED, this disease that's causing huge problems in learn more about a second virus, a Delta coronavirus, in association with PED, and what it actually means. And also probably of greatest importance is that PED has been present throughout Europe for many years. And in fact, there are outbreaks in Italy and in Germany in the last couple of months, but causing very few problems. And really saying, well, what's different? Why is it such a problem in the US and not a problem in Europe? So they're the sort of questions that they would seek fairly rapid responses, although it can take quite some time, some months. The second area that EFSA would work with, the Animal Health and Welfare Panel, would be looking at endemics, TB, of course, and particular issues relating to TB, including the equivalence of gamma interferon as an official test in comparison with skin-based testing. And the UK, the problem there is really so critical that people are now focused on vaccinating cattle, which has huge problems in terms of will the vaccine work, but it has huge problems in terms of diagnosis. Leishmaniasis, EBL I mentioned, and at the moment there's for the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in France, but also in Ireland, there's been huge problems with oyster mortalities, mainly related to a herpes virus, but there's also a Vibrio species that's emerging as a potential problem. And then lastly, welfare, and I have no background in welfare, but I find it very interesting, and I think the group does work that actually has the potential to impact here. Part of it is really a summary of knowledge, and that's really a review of literature. But part of it in the European setting is there's very much a focus moving away from animal welfare as a theoretical concept, or perhaps a philosophical concept, through to, well, how do we actually assess it in a very practical sense? Procedures in slaughterhouses through to monitoring welfare of cows in small scale. A lot of that is linked to the and then at times, particularly Brazil, but also countries in the EU would say, look, we think we have a better way of studying animals. It's just prior to slaughter, and this is really saying, well, are these robust studies? Are they good enough for policy people to say, well, change on the basis of that and get equivalent welfare outcomes using perhaps more cost-effective methodology. So just in conclusion, just 2 points. The first one is that in Ireland, the model that we've used, I think has been very successful. It's a very, for all the reasons I said, it's certainly a really interesting place for me to work, because what we do has immediate impact in terms of the policy nationally and also within the EU. Second point is that in Europe, and I think it's probably not quite the same here, I'm not sure, in the US for sure, but there's considerable care to ensure this separation between risk assessment, the science, and risk management or the policy. I'll leave it there. Now, I used to have photos, photos of Australia, but over the last few years I've decided really not appropriate. But I do an awful lot of walking, long distance walking. So thanks very much. Thank you.